This week I was focusing on clay reclamation in my home studio. So what I've done is I've taken bone dry bowls that I don't want to fire, and these are pre-bisque state. And then when I know they're bone dry, I break them down into this clay reclamation bucket that I have. This bucket contains loads of slip and offcuts and trimmings from previous projects. And once the bucket gets to a certain volume of clay, it starts to look a little bit like this. So consistency similar to porridge. Once it's got to a state like this and the water's been reduced, I give it a really good stir, making sure to scrape my hands against the edge of the container to remove any of the excess clay. And then after a few days, it's dried out and I can move it to the homemade slab that I've made. I've made a previous video on this, on how I made the slab, so I definitely recommend going through my channel and taking a look. But basically you just put all of the reclamation clay on the slab and it draws out all the moisture from inside of it. It's really important to make sure that the clay surface itself is nice and smooth, and this will enable it to dry consistently. After a few days, you can see it's kind of gone a bit hard and in a leather-like state. That's what we want. So I'm going to remove the slab and then begin merging the clay together to make a consistent body. So I begin by slamming the clay piece down on the table as hard as I can, and this starts to wedge it all together, removing any air pockets and starting to stretch the clay a little bit as well. So I'll repeat this quite a few times before I've got a nice square shape. Next I want to be slicing off little chunks. So you can see here I'm just taking layers off and just stacking them on top of each other. And this will ensure that I'm again mixing the clay so that all the clay particles inside are roughly a consistent thickness. The last thing you want is for some part of the clay to have bigger lumps and chunks in it. And what I'll do is I'll continue to slice and then knead the clay into that square shape again, and then continue that process until I'm happy with the consistency. Fortunately, I did quite a lot of mixing during the early process, and the clay is relatively consistent throughout, which is really good news. So once I've sliced everything into thin layers, I'll then repeat the process of slamming it down on the table and pressing the clay in and kneading it into clay blocks or larger balls of clay to be used mixing later. So there's the bottom end of the piece, and you can see how dry that looks in comparison to some of the slices that I've previously done. And again, as mentioned, just slamming it against the table to make it all stick together and make it all bond with each other and remove some of those air particles. This is a bit too big for me to knead effectively, so I'm going to cut it in half, and then I'll knead half and then join them up later. So now I've cut it in half, I want to make it into a oblong shape, and that'll help with the next process that's to come. So for this bit I've sped it up because it can be a little bit boring watching me knead it all. But what we're doing here is we're stretching the clay particles to remove any air, but also make sure that it's consistent throughout. Once I've done that, I'll slam it together into a tube, and then it can be reused into a bowl or anything you want. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like and subscribe.